Bank of Baroda Betak. I just want to take this opportunity again to give some thank yous. This is my last session that I'm going to be introducing on this stage in this very, very special place of Hotel Diggy Palace, which we are eternally grateful for that they have hosted this festival and make it what it is. I would also like to thank my venue volunteers who work so hard to make sure that you have a good, safe, interesting, exciting time. So if I could ask you to give a round of applause for my venue volunteers. Thank you very much for that. And so now, a quick note before we start this session. We are still awaiting Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. We hope that he will arrive in a few minutes, so that is why... Oh, he's just arrived. Way, thank you very much. Thank you to the man doing some good pointing over there. So in that case... For this session, Poetry, Searching the Sources, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Ashok Vajpeyi, and Ranjit Hoskote in conversation with Ruth Padel.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on the poetic imagination. So I'm with three, I'm glad it is three, not two as we had a second ago. I'm with three really wonderful Indian poets of different sorts. On my right here I have Ashok Vajpeyi, is that the right? Vajpeyi? And then Ranjit Hoskote and Arvind Mehrotra. And we're going to be talking about something that's really important for poetry all over the world, for global poetry, as with the internet, poetry is becoming more and more global. But also it's really important, it seems, for India and Indian poets, because there are so many languages here. How do poets read each other? Ever since I've been coming to India for the last sort of 20, 25 years, and I've talked to poets everywhere, and then I started to realize how hard it is that here is this foreign language imposed upon India, namely English, but it seems to function as the kind of HTML of poetry, that a Marathi poet, how can he or she read a poet from the Punjab or Tamil and Bengal, for instance? And all these people have written wonderful poems of their own and face this problem, I suppose, daily. Would that be? Is that a problem?
Not exactly, because our language geography is quite big, and the number of people reading your language or reacting and responding in your language is quite large. So it's not as if you feel, but there are occasions when you feel that you had things translated, and that's why we value translation as poets. But it's not a problem in that sense. Secondly, in many Indian languages, I mean, there are all kinds of shades and permutation and combination. There are languages which are very hospitable to translation. For instance, Hindi, my mother tongue, Kannada, Malayalam, Odia, they are some of the languages which are rather hospitable, and they keep on translating from other Indian languages. There are languages which are unfortunately not so hospitable. I mean, the well-known Bengali is not very hospitable, unfortunately. So, anyway, there are translations of all kinds, and good, bad, indifferent. But the fact is that there are people who would like to read translation, to react to translation from other Indian poets. There's a vast level of curiosity as to knowing what is happening in the other language. And that many a time we have been influenced in our own creative endeavor by reading somebody else, some other language translations. So translations also create a geography of influence apart from communication.
Yes. Because so, Arvind, you've been very influenced by the beat poets, by William Carlos Williams, but also Kabir. Would you like to talk a little bit about your influences in other languages and what you do with them in your head and your heart when you receive these very, very different things? What do you do with them? What alchemy happens? What happens when you read poems in another language that then influences what you write?
Is the mic on? Yeah. You know what happens when I read other?
How does an influence, this word influence?
How does it influence? Okay. No, yesterday was the 26th of January and they closed the bar. So I have had too much to have at the lunch. Now, so what happened is that when I started writing in English, say 50 years ago, I did not have a language. So the whole effort was to create a language in which to write. What I had was a middle-class sense of English, which you got in the 1960s when you went to an English medium school. Now, obviously, that language was not enough to write poetry in. So I had to invent this English, which I'm still inventing. So that was my problem. And one of the ways I invented this English to make it viable for myself is by reading works in English translation, especially from the European languages. And there were two important anthologies, and Ruth will remember them, and Ashok will. There was Alvarez, the new poetry, and there was Donald Hall. So Donald Hall, Alvarez introduced us both to British, American, and to European poetry. And through it's a mix of the American, the British, and the Europeans that we created a lot of our own poetry. And it was not coming to me from Aurobindo, God forbid. It was not coming to me from Sarojini Naidu. It was neither coming to me from the British Romantic tradition. So all that was past, all that was dead. The Americans were very helpful. So that is where William Carlos Williams comes in. And that's where the beats, they also come in. Here was someone, when Ginsberg would say, America, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb, then you realized you could use a word like fuck. And you could be anti-national. So this was a very early lesson in anti-nationalism, when in the 60s, Allen Ginsberg spoke those lines, or Corso, or Ferlinghetti. So that was my introduction, both to the English language and to poetry.
Thank you. And Ranjit, you've had such different influences. You've had Kashmiri poetry on the one hand. You go to Germany a lot, so you must have read all the German Romanticism and so on. Well, how do you experience an influence, and what do you do with it?
I would probably use the word confluence instead of the word influence, because influence somehow suggests a kind of donor, receiver, master-apprentice kind of relationship. And I'm actually much happier as a multilingual person with this notion of confluence. Things flow together. So it's not as if I have to give up one thing to receive another. It's just that as poets, we all have a kaleidoscopic subjectivity. So it's a question of reaching out in a purely artisanal way to things that work for you at different levels. So reaching out to Kashmiri for me is for deeply personal ancestral reasons. To, if you will, reclaim a part of my own heritage, which has been lost over years of diaspora, if you will. But I'm not going to make that a pessimistic, negative kind of reading. It's really about releasing yourself and your work to a situation, a predicament, a people. And that would work equally with German for me. It's not about isolating the literature. It's also finding a way of participating in the historical predicament of the place from which the poetry comes. I don't know if this makes sense.
No, well, I think there are so many elements here, because one is, as far as I'm concerned, one is when a poet does something and you think, oh, I could do that. And it could be anything. It could be an image, it could be a way of looking at something or a perspective. And so that can go into the social milieu, can't it? So you can be sort of thinking about politics, for instance. We're thinking about Kashmiri poetry now. Or it could be about a form, a new form. When the Greek poet George Seferis, for instance, he read a lot of T.S. Eliot, but he also read Baudelaire. And so he was influenced by two traditions, which were different from his own Greek traditions. So I was wondering, I mean, how about faithfulness? When you're actually doing a translation as opposed to writing your own work, how faithful are you supposed to be? Because I was trained in Greek and Latin, so I was a Greek and Latin scholar, but I cannot translate from those languages. When I translate from ancient Greek, I feel so faithful to the old Greek words, and I want to explain to people what they mean, and that's not how you write a poem. So the most successful translation I think I've ever done was from Russian, which is a language I don't know. I got 3 translations and I worked through them, and I was amazed at Pushkin's images. But that was a version. So what do you feel about this sort of difference between writing a version of a classic, say, and writing a translation?
Well, I would say that in India, the situation of translation is a double-edged thing. One is that you are translated if you're lucky. And I have been not entirely unlucky. So you are translated into Marathi or Malayalam or Bengali or
Can you hear
whatever.
okay? Back.
Yes? Oh, no? You can't?
Put it closer
Okay.
to your mouth.
Okay. So you can be translated into languages which you just don't understand at all. So you have to leave it to the translator to do whatever he does. After all, translators most of the times are also poets, and they have a right to recreate you in their language. Something which goes well in your own language may not go so well in the translated language. 1. 2, if I go back and recall my influences, I would say that initial kind of romance with Yeats and Eliot and Auden, etc., withered away, and we started reading European poets, Rilke and Ibn Foix, and later the Polish and the Hungarian and the Czech, who revealed an entirely different poetics of irony, of indirection, of being human in very different ways. Then we were sort of influenced by the Latin American poets, Pablo Neruda and Octavio Paz and things of that kind. So translations also create a geography of influences. And in many ways, one of the things that seem to have happened in most Indian languages, I dare say, after independence, that we became aware of languages other than English. I lived in a small town called Sagar, which was a bit of a kasbah. But there by the time I came to St. Stephen's, I had already read Rilke and Pablo Neruda and Octavio Paz and so, because the books were available in the library. So as for the translation, I have been translated into English, and I think rather well. And there are nuances which are lost, but those nuances cannot possibly be achieved. I myself translated 5 major Polish poets. And I gave up some poems because the imagery was so deeply Christian that translating that into Hindi would not make it come. So translation also is a matter of choice. What you choose to translate and what you may not find translatable.
When they have a phrase in Italian, traduttore traditore, that the translator is a betrayer. What do you feel about that?
On the other hand, Octavio Paz said, poetry, the adage was, poetry is lost in translation. And he said, poetry is what survives translation.
Some people say translation is like the other side of embroidery. When you turn over the embroidery, there are all the colors there, but you've lost the form. Say, Arvind, how do you feel about that? About whether you are being faithful.
He has been a very eminent translator.
Yes, whether you are being faithful to the poem or to your own sense of the poem, or do you feel what is lost, or do you think that what is found in translation is the poetry?
Well, I have one basic principle where translation goes, which is it is best not to know the language. And I think that is a great advantage if you can understand the language in bits and parts, like Prakrit. I have translated from the Prakrit. You ask me to read 2 lines of Prakrit and I won't be able to read it. You ask me to read Kabir, whom I've translated fairly successfully given the royalty I receive. But still, if you ask me to read a whole Kabir pad from beginning to end, I'm going to fumble half the words I won't understand. Now, the thing is that you don't really need to understand every word in order to translate. And so there have been great translations from all over the world. Christopher Logue. Did Christopher Logue know any Greek? But he's probably done the most readable Homer. Did W.S. Merwin know any Mandelstam? He did not know any Mandelstam. But he's still done Mandelstam along with Clarence Brown. So you can do it with a language specialist. The idea is to have some sense. You should have some sense of what poetry is. You ought to know where a line break is. You ought to know where an image is. You ought to have some sense of what your own strengths are, what you can do and what you can't do. So when you are translating, you play to your strengths rather than to your weaknesses. So you do, which is what Ashok was saying, you translate what you can translate. So it didn't. Now, when I'm translating modern Hindi poetry, it's the opposite. When I'm translating Vinod Kumar Shukla or Nirala or Manglesh Dabral, I'm not playing around, because there I can read every word and read it because it's my own language. But there I stick very close to the original, as close as I can. But when you are translating a 2nd century AD poem, then you have to make it contemporary. Now, this is the other thing. Vinod Kumar Shukla, I don't have to make contemporary because he is contemporary. So if you are translating Kabir from the 15th century, you cannot translate him in any 15th century idiom. You have to translate him into American, which is the language that we all speak. Now, I didn't realize I was speaking American, but when the translations of Kabir came out, everyone said, this is an American. Then I realized, okay, this is an American. You're speaking American all your life. Now, because also we cannot distinguish between Indian English, American English, and British English. We keep slipping between the 3. So it needs. So this is the kind of translation world from which I come. I'll just add one more thing, that for me, translation and writing my own poems are part of the same process. I don't kind of distinguish that this is a translation and this is my own poem. They require as much work as your own poem does. It's not that translation you do with your left hand when you're feeling. No, the translation is as much part of your work as your own poem is. The translation goes under another person's name, your own poems go under your name, but the labor required of both is the same.
So, Ranjit, what do you think about this idea of closeness and betrayal and the sense of, because after all, we're a bridge. If you're translating something, you're a bridge between one language and your audience. And how faithfully do you want to give it to them? Do you want to give them the spirit of it or the words? What do you want to give them?
After thinking about this and having responded to questions about translation for a long time, I finally come around to a formulation, which is this. Because often people come up to you and say, right, okay, you've done this, but is this a literal translation? The simple answer is as follows. There can be no literal translations because there are no literal originals. Yeah? And frankly, that's that. Because also from what Arvind has just been saying, the fact is that every generation produces or should produce a new translation of a whole range of texts. There is no way that you can possibly access a text in its entirety. in its totality. I mean, by definition, particularly poetic texts are inexhaustible. So how do they release themselves to you? What are you bearing witness to? These questions are important to me. I don't really care about betrayal, because I don't think this is a betrayal of the text. It's actually a reanimation of a text. Having said that, my position would be a little different from Arvind's, because we share the same situation, because for me too, translation is part of my practice as a poet. But for my sins, I also have another side, which is the researcher, the linguist, and I'm a kind of obsessive annotator. So I feel with certain texts that I need to have, if it's not fidelity to the literal text, because as I said, there are no literal texts, but there is a sense of fidelity to context. Like the Laldir translation, which you referred to, I felt very, very strongly that I had to bear witness there to the multiple political, religious, literary contexts from which this voice or these voices emerged. I also needed to say, as a result, not of the translation directly, but out of the research, that this is not a single voice, it's not a single author. What you find in the works of Laldir actually is an expanded portrait of people across castes, class, religions, degrees of literacy who contributed anonymously to this evolving corpus. So how I respond to the corpus of a mystic poet whose work has been elaborated over several centuries is different from how I would approach, say, Mir Taqi Mir, the great Urdu poet of the late 18th and early 19th century. I've been working on that now. There I have a different set of reflexes. I work from a spirit of curiosity and enthusiasm. I'm amazed at how he transits from Persianate usage to Braj to things he invents to forms that I recognize as having fallen out of the language. So it's a different kind of archaeology. So I would actually, rather than see the translator as a traitor, I would see the translator as someone operating from a spirit of archaeological curiosity, someone operating in the spirit of a dancer. And I think these figures are as important to our work as translators.
Yeah, because the English word translation comes from Latin, which means carry across. I carry across. And if you put that into Greek, you get metapherein, which is the origin of metaphor. So metaphor itself is something that is carrying across. Aristotle says in the Poetics that metaphor carries something from a home place to a foreign place. And of course, in psychoanalysis, transference is the same word. So transference, translation, and metaphor are all the same activity, which is taking something from me to you, from one person or soul or place or habitat to another.
Can I just come in on this? I mean, because you've raised the trope of psychoanalysis, I think it's precisely because it's a certain kind of transference, it doesn't necessarily go from me to you, but there's also a third thing, as Freud pointed out. There's another kind of psychoanalytic object, and I think translation works in precisely that way. A third thing is produced, which may not belong to me or to you, but we both need to figure out how we belong to it.
I just wondered, have you brought any poem which you could read?
Let me just add one thing. The important thing in translation is whether you are able to carry the voice of the original poet in whatever manner in the translation. The translation itself must be a poem in its own right. It should exist without the clutches of being a translation. So you're not giving any concession to the fact that it has to be an autonomous poem. And yet it has to somehow carry the voice. I translated Szymborska, the Polish poet, and she came at the release of the book in Krakow. And she saw, she was as charming as you are, and she kept on looking at me when I read the Hindi versions. She couldn't. Later, and she spoke English very rarely, she said, I didn't understand a word of what you were saying, but I liked the music of your language. Now, in a certain sense, this is I don't want to self-congratulate myself, but I had a degree of satisfaction that if a person like Shimboska finds that in the translation there's some music. The second thing, many of us, at least I can speak for myself, would not have been the kind of poets we are, good or bad, unless there existed a huge amount of translations of poetry of the world. They have influenced us, they have shaped us, they have made us realize how many hundreds of ways are there of being human in language, in poetry. So translations have not merely been influences, they have played a very creative, dynamic role in our shaping as poets. And each time you are translating a poet, you are making, hopefully, if you are good, making that poem come alive in a language other than his or her own. And this is not a simple task. I mean, translators in this country are not well regarded. The kind of regard that they enjoy perhaps in the Western sphere. Recently, a publisher came to me and published my complete poems. So I gave him my complete poems. But he said, what about your translations? So I was very pleasantly surprised, because this is the first time that complete works of a poet include a whole volume of his translations. Because translations are also very much a part of your creative endeavor, but it is not recognized as such. So I was very, very pleasantly surprised. So this is happening somewhat belatedly, and he quoted to me Ezra Pound. He says, in the complete works of Ezra Pound, there are poems, translate all the translation, and of some translation which the original poem did not exist. There's supposed to be a Chinese poem which he translated, which after much research was discovered that no such poem exists in Chinese. But anyway, translators can create new poems, why not?
Well, so we've got this idea really of opening windows. You're opening windows onto new poems. So that's a different thing from the music. The music is terribly important. So both of you, how do you feel about do you feel you're creating a new music when you do into another language a poem that has got its own music in its first language?
Yeah, there's, talking about the music, there is only one music I know, which is the music I make. There is only one language in which I can translate, which is the English I know. I don't have another music for translation and another music for my own poems. So if all my translations sound like me, that's all right. If I start sounding like my translations, that is also all right. It is the same process. Something you call translation, something you call your own original, within quotes, work. But it comes out of the same creative. Only in translation, you have something to come back to. When you're translating, you can move away from the original, but there is an original. But when you're writing your own poem, you discover the original at the end of the process. You see, the original is something you are seeking. You may or may not arrive at the original. If you don't get the original, it's a bad poem. You chuck it away. But with the translation, however far you may go from the text in your imagination, or actually working through a poem, you always can refer back to the translation. You can look at the Kabir poem and say, this is what Kabir said, and what have I been doing all these months? So that is the only difference. So where the music is concerned, I think one only translates in one's own music. So there I don't have a different music. So the translation may have its own music, I'm not denying that. But then if my translations end up sounding like poems of William Carlos Williams, I can't help it. Or like the early Pound. So if they all sound like William Carlos Williams, and they all sound something from Spring and all, so be it. It doesn't.
But yes. But I was just sort of thinking that often I think when I'm writing a poem, the poem is creating its own music, and each poem tries to create its own sound world. And sometimes it doesn't go wrong, and then I feel the poem is just telling me, go away, you're not doing me right. So I feel that I perhaps have different musics, but I don't know yet what the poem is going to discover. What about you, Ranjit?
I agree. I'm not sure I agree with Arvind here, but we have to define our poetics as they're true to us. For me, it's an artisanal challenge always to either work with the music that's evolving for me, or to reach out and be stretched by the music of, particularly in translation, by the music of the language or the voice, as you said, Ashokji, what I'm hearing. And sometimes that has outcomes in my own poetry in the long term. And I'm actually quite happy to have my own music disrupted. I'm happy to improvise around it and work with that notion of linguistic stretch and exploring musicalities of different kinds.
So can we hear a poem from each of you? It doesn't have to be a translation. If you would prefer to read a poem of your own which you feel has been affected in some way by another poetry, that would be wonderful. So I put them on the spot here. I didn't realize we didn't. All right, let's hear a poem from you, Ranjit Hoskote. Oh, all right, Ashok.
I'm reading a translation.
Great.
Not done by me, by Rahul Soni, of a poem, a short poem. I want. A small house won't do. I want the whole earth, surrounded by its plants, seas, and people. A window won't suffice. I want the whole sky filled with its countless stars and planets. This little lamp can't quell my darkness. I want a brilliant, blazing sun. A few words are not enough to make a poem. I want all of language, all the green of the earth, all the blue of the sky, all the red of sunrise.
A few words are not enough to make a poem. I love that. Arvind, have you?
I'm always more excited to read translations than my own poems. So I'll read a poem by one of my favorite poets anywhere, which is Vinod Kumar Shukla. And the man responsible for bringing Vinod Kumar Shukla to the world of poetry is Ashok Vajpeyi. In 1970-71, he brought out a small pamphlet called Lagbhag Jai Hind, from Siddhi, where he was a collector, and Pehchan, that was the. So Vinod Kumar's career, owes a lot to Ashok. This is a poem which I must tell you about Vinod Kumar Shukla. I must, give you one example of who this man is. I published a poem of his in Granta, and I called him because they wanted his, his bank account number to transfer money. And I said that, your poem is appearing in Granta, and they want this. And he said to me in Hindi, Arvind ji, aapne kya kaha, Granth? Humne kaha, nahi, Granth nahi. Uski magazine is called Granta. It's not Granth. And the Granta editor was not very happy to hear that someone is being published in Granta and doesn't even know what the bloody thing is. She never wrote back to me after that. But that's the kind of person he is. So there are very few people anywhere in the world who've been published in Granta.
I'll add, when I first published his book of poems, I was a civil servant, and I've been asking him to send his poems. He had not published a book before. And he promised and he never sent, so I sent a policeman to his house to collect his poems, to sit down if they are not copied already. And the first book came out, and I sent him 25 copies. Vinod Kumar Shukla, later I met him after 2-3 years in Bhopal, and I asked him, did you receive those copies? He says, yes. What did you do? I gave one copy to my uncle, one is with me, and there are 23 still there. This is his first book.
Anyway, that's the story. You have to send a policeman to his house if you want to get poems out of him. But he is actually one of the great Indian poets. And a great Indian short story writer and a prose writer. It's one of those great. Anyway, there are 4 or 5 translations in this. I'll read a very short one. This is the one which appeared in Ranta. It's called This Colorful Picture. This colorful picture, picked up in the bazaar and hanging on the wall, is of chubby, pink-faced children, so unlike our own, who are neither as chubby nor as pretty, nor wear such nice clothes. These pictures sell a lot. There's always someone in every family who'll feel as a father feels and bring one home. The truth is, though no one says it, they're all worried about their children.
Thank you, Arvind. Ranjit.
Before I read this is not a translation. It's really a new poem that I'm going to read. But I'm going to say that it's been absolutely marvelous to go back to these archives of memories here, because when I was publishing my early poems, I have to say, in the late 80s and early 90s, our points of inspiration were not only the Penguin Modern Poetry in Translation series, but also the very important work that Arvind was doing at that point with Satvahan Hal, a book that became The Absent Traveler, and Ramanujan's amazing series of translations from the Tamil and the Kannada. So that idea that part of your vocation, literally as a poet, your voicing, that translation was part of that vocation was always integral to certainly how my generation thought of this. I'm going to read a poem called Haji Ali, and those of you who know Bombay will know that it's a Sufi shrine on a tidal island. Haji Ali. You wouldn't remember me. I came and went like rain out of season. At Haji Ali, the stoplights changed without recording my passage. I stumbled along the beach, the sea snapping at my heels, guardian angel of the weather with one wing broken. I couldn't stop summer when it prowled and roared in streets that should have been flooded. Every screen in every movie hall was set to 0 or lower. I couldn't push back the tide when it washed over the narrow road pointing to the Saints' Island. All I could do when I left was to gather up and carry every one of your boats away. They're riding at anchor in this song you've been trying to remember.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, one of the things, listening to you all, that the poems and what you say, makes me think that we live in a time when we are all responding to the environment and trying to share our responses. And the environment includes other people, other languages, other literatures. And so the language we've been talking is about inspiration. So that comes from inspiring. It comes from breathing in the air. And also influence, which is about liquid. It's about the rivers flowing into us. And so I'm just wondering about, now we live in a time when we are all so connected by the internet, by this other sort of technology, but we are also closing up. A lot of nationalisms are closing up on themselves. What do you think poets and poet translators can do to open those conduits, open those sharings in language and in how we see?
Well, these are hard times, and yet all times, however hard they are, can be broken through. And one of the jobs of poetry in our time is, because we are now living in regimes of lies about everything, almost everything. Therefore, one of the jobs of poetry in such trying times is to stick to its own truth, to dare to speak it even if it is not appreciated or not accepted or attacked or misinterpreted, etc. One, because that will create a sharing. There are people who are troubled by lies, who are also troubled by the fact that there are not many people speaking the truth. So, truth can be itself can be an obsession of a certain kind of poetry in these times, and it can also create a solidarity, a kind of a camaraderie. The truth can be, it doesn't mean great truths, wisdom and cosmic mysteries, and there are mysteries and small truths in being human, being helpful, being empathetic, feeling for fellow beings, telling the person sitting next to you that you matter, that you are a human being. Now, poetry can perhaps create that. I mean, at least some of us have grown in the belief that poetry can make some difference to the world. But perhaps this is who Adorno or whoever called, is a disappointed hope.
A disappointed hope. And yes, well, I was thinking as you talked about something Seamus Heaney said, which it doesn't matter if you're telling, as it were, a lie in the poem, as long as you're true to your imagination. You can have, you can say, I did this and I did that, and it's not true at all. But the truth has to be about your own feeling. So this is going back to translation. It's going back to saying, I'm making a bridge between me and you. So I wanted to talk about going back to the old, to the translations of the Mahabharata, translations of the very old things, which everybody knows in lots of different versions. What sorts of truth do you think that people find in those new translations now? What sort of truth for their own lives?
Yeah,
We're talking about truth.
I haven't done the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. I've just translated 60 or 70 poems by Kabir. That's the other text, the Prakrit text, is erotic verse. So that is not. But the Kabir is the closest I've come to any kind of religious bhakti poetry. And what I've found there about the Indian tradition, and also in the Prakrit, and I've spoken about that on several occasions, that it is a very disruptive tradition. The whole Indian tradition is basically a disruptive tradition. And things start settling down, someone comes and disrupts it. Now, this latest disruption is of another order altogether, because this is a kind of all-encompassing disruption. But there have been other disruptions also. Kabir's bhakti poetry was another disruptive voice. And the disruption, time and again, has to be about the caste system, which is one of the great evils of the society, and about religious divide. And I've always thought of Kabir as a hater of mankind. He is someone, he's called the poet of love and bhakti and all that. That's rubbish. He hated humanity. And he hated them with a passion, and he especially hated religious denominations. So he made fun of Hindus as much as he made fun of the Muslims. The Muslim, he said that if you are a Turk, that's the word he used for a Muslim, then if God wanted you to be a Muslim, you should have been circumcised in your mother's womb. Then you would have been a true Muslim. Any damn fool can come out of his mother's womb and get himself circumcised. Similarly, he said about a Brahmin, that if you are a Brahmin, then there wasn't another passage through which you came into the world. So he's very, very blunt, very direct, and which is why he has survived for these 500, at least 500, 600 years, and which is why no written text of his in his own hand survives. So his part still continues to be part of the oral tradition, which is also what the Ramayana is to a large extent.
Thank you. Well, Ranjit.
If I may add, I think translation in some times plays the role of dissidence and resistance. So when you are translating Kabir or citing Kabir or reading Faiz, for instance, recently, what you're doing is that you are bringing what you're not able to say directly yourself, you make the translated poet say it. He has already said it. So you take recourse to that. Look, in the Soviet, when there was this communist regime and all the tyrannies, there were poets who were translating.
What happens is that if I want to abuse both Hindus and Muslims, which I want to do all the time, I don't have to do it in my own voice. I can say Kahat Kabir. You see? So I said Kabir says, and I can do it. I can say what I want about these two creatures, one called Hindu and the other called Muslim. So this is the great freedom, which is translation as dissidence.
Arvind, I'm going to throw back at you a line from one of your poems. A borrowed voice sets the true one free. A borrowed voice sets the true one free.
No, but you translated Amir Khusro. Didn't you?
Me, Mir Taki Mir.
No? No, somebody else did. And
You're
it's called
about to.
A Poet in the Bazaar. And this was published when the bazaar had become a very massive evil and presence.
Sunil Sharma and Paul.
Here is a poet, Amir Khusro, who is a poet in bazaar, because he is talking about bazaar. In fact, Kabir has also talked a lot about bazaar. And Ghalib also talked about a lot of bazaar. So you can find resonances in translation which really respond to or address your contemporary concerns and anxieties.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I think we might throw it open now to questions. We have about 14 and a half minutes for your questions, and I think there's a roving mic here. Does anybody would like to start? Yes, over here.
My name is A.J. Thomas. I write poetry in English and I translate from Malayalam. Siba Ashokji was saying about, carrying the voice in the original and also getting the musical effect or the music. I think he has been lucky to, carry the music of Simbotka. But in my experience, translating O.N.V. Kurup, the Jnanpith Award-winning Malayalam poet, in metrical words, what he wrote, I could not translate that into English. And he knew, if I try also, it would be fruitless, because what is there in the original Malayalam metrical verse with the kind of rhythms and melodies, it's impossible to carry across. So we have that limitation to translating that kind of poetry.
I think this question was really answered by Auden when he introduced Kawafi translation, the first one, Ray Devlin's translation of Kawafi. And he said you can only translate the image. So the image, the music you forget about. That is very hard to do, and it'll take all your energy, and you'll end up making a mess of it, perhaps. But there are certain things you can translate, and the image is one thing that you can very easily translate. So when I was doing the Kabir, I was sticking to those poems in which the image is predominant. And you can get the sense of the whole poem through the image. But the music is lost. The poem's meant to be sung, and that singing quality is gone.
Incidentally, may I clarify, when Szymborska said, I like the music of your language, she was referring to Hindi language, not to the music of her own poetry, which I had not really translated. But she liked the language, that's it.
That's I've because of being a classicist, I've worked with a lot of translations and with the Latin and the Greek. And ever since the Renaissance, people have been translating Virgil and Homer and all the others into the European languages. And it's very, very hard to do. They didn't rhyme even if you have an inflected language like Italian and not English, which is a non-inflected language, you can't repeat the kind of structures that words go into in Latin or in Greek. So I think I love Arvind's sort of explanation that I have my own music and the new poem has to go into that. Yes, a very interesting question. Absolutely.
Ruth, I think there might also be room for questions of something that seems more elusive, which is tonality. I mean, I agree with Arvind that questions of image, I mean, it's very important, but the image can also be treacherous. It's like a crystal. It has many different dimensions, and you have to pick some of them. But tonality, I think, is something that you can engage with. Not voice, not music, not image, but perhaps a kind of tonality. It's slightly more elusive, but I think that's a challenge for us as translators.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. Another one here.
I just wanted to add that when you translate, you lose some music, you also add some music. So that is what happens. You try and balance the loss with what it is.
Excuse me, I'm very curious to know all the writers who have given the work for translation. Have you ever faced the trouble of over-creative translators?
The over-creative translator. Yes, there's a famous little reading from the British poet Geoffrey Hill, who was writing about his childhood, and he said that he was born on the M6, which is a motorway going up to the north. Well, an American, so this isn't even in translation, an American who didn't know about the motorways in England was explaining that actually he had been a member of M6, the MI6, the Secret Service. So that was a very good example of an over-creative response to a poem. About over-creative translations? No.
Different registers, I think. A recent experience for me has been working with someone who's translating some of my poems into Hindi. And to have that sense of the voice bouncing back in different ways, I have to say I've enjoyed that as someone being translated now. Also because there are all kinds of word choices and register choices that come into play. Sometimes I found that an excessively Sanskritic vocabulary, which unfortunately comes normally now for certain historical reasons, is not what's working for me. I would prefer something more colloquial, something more Persianate. So I also think that in the best case, if both the poet and the translator are alive and have some sense of each other's languages, this can be an expression of creative engagement.
Yes. Another question over there, and then over here.
Hello everyone. I would like to ask that when you give your poems for translation and when you let your poems free to go around the world, how you feel when you realize that when someone will read it, it won't be the same. How you feel, how you read it?
That's a wonderful question. It's almost, I mean, in a way, every other mind, when you read a poem and somebody receives it in whatever language, there is a translation going on. It is being reworked into somebody else's sensibilities, somebody else's mind and imagination. But I don't know, how do you feel when?
Well, I would say a poem has many lives, many avatars, if you like. One of them is the original. The translated version is another avatar. And somebody reading it in that language is a third avatar. So a poem has to necessarily live several lives. There is no other way. And I think each avatar ultimately relates to the same damn thing in some sense or the other. So,
but it's never the same thing even in the same language. I mean, you have readers who might read your poem, it's not the same.
I don't have any problem with that. I don't have any problem even with a mistranslation. I'll give you an example. Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, the Nobel awardee, we were translating him from Polish into Hindi. And we had the English version, complete works, authorized by him. And all of a sudden, my co-translator pointed out that in the English version, 4 lines are missing. 4 lines. So I said, what do you mean? This has been authorized by Miłosz himself. She said, no, but these lines are not there. And she told me the lines. So what decision we took was that we are not going to refer to the English translation. We are going to translate from Polish into Hindi. So there are all kinds of, shall we say, accident and mishaps on way to translation and from translation. It can be.
Yes, thank you. There's another question down here. We have 5 more minutes.
I have a two-pronged question. Firstly, that when you're translating a poem that's written by somebody else, how much of your poetic personality do you allow to be reflected in that poem? And secondly, when you're translating a poem, do you do it from the perspective of the poet who's written it or the audience who are going to be reading it?
Well, okay, so the question is, first of all, say it once more, the first question.
How much of your personality reflects in the translated version of the poem?
Okay, how much of your personality goes into
I can
it?
just answer the first, I'll answer the second one. I think I have only my personality to work with. The other personality comes to me through the language, but eventually I'll be returning to the original time and again, but finally it is my personality which is going to show through, and I hope the other poet's personality is obliterated. I've said once too many times that the translator shoots to kill, and you basically want to obliterate the original, and instead of the original, you want your name to be there. So it is your personality. I'm giving you an example of Arun Kolhatkar, who translated Janabai. But when you look at the poem on the page, it is like a poem by E. Cummings. And he translated it into the contemporary American idiom. The first two lines read, "God, my darling, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law." You get my point? Now, this is pure Kolhatkar. This is not Janabai.
Arvind, that's what Janabai says in Marathi.
Yeah, this is in Marathi. This is a Marathi poem of the 13th century. So when you say, "God, my darling, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law," now this is when you read Bhakti poetry. Bhakti poet after Bhakti poet has said the same thing. Kabir has also said it. Basically, you destroy the family to be one with God. This is what is being said. But the way he says it, Kolhatkar says it, interpreting Janabai, is to make it contemporary. The idiom is contemporary, the form is contemporary. So what has happened is he's stamped his personality onto Janabai's personality. Is that all right? Yeah, okay.
I also think that poetry is very much about relationship. So it's about the relationship of two languages, the language it's in and the language in relation to, but it's also, of course, about the relationship of the reader and the relationship of the voice of the poet. And these relationships get tangled up like bits of wool. Yes.
The poetic personality is vulnerable to the other. That's why you are translating at all. I mean, it is not as if you're wanting to impose your personality, but there is no other escape. I mean, you have to be writing with your poetic personality, which will carry the imprint of your personality on the translation. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's translation are quite different from Robert Bly's translation, for instance, or that Dharwadkar, in Linda Hess' translation. All the three translations you can read as versions of the impress of the personalities of three different persons. Yeah.
Yes, there's one more question back at the back.
So most of us in India are multilingual. So what do you think, which is better, translating your own work into another language, or getting it translated by someone else would enrich it more? Like Girish Karnad, for example, he used to translate all of his works by himself, which is pretty good as well. So do you think when you translate your own work, you get the point across much better, or is it better to get it translated from someone else?
Well, I have never translated myself. I have, I think, a reasonable knowledge of English, but I have dared not, because it's so boring to do it again in another language. I'm a lazy person, so I thought, let somebody else do it. But there are people who have translated, and not necessarily very well. So there are mixed kind of examples. There are examples where somebody has translated very well, but sometimes your translation of your own work can be lacking in many ways.
I've got a question which is related to this. I mean, if you've written the poem once in Hindi, why would you want to write it in English?
Actually, I do have a response to that. I'm going to invoke Arun Kolhatkar as well. Arun famously translated his own poems from English into Marathi or the other way around. But if you look at these two poems in two different languages, they are not the same poems. The English is actually crystalline, it's more American, it's slangy. The Marathi version is immersed in local color, in regional vernacular, in the best sense versions.
Yeah.
So they're not the same poem. So there is a way in which, if you're fluently bilingual, you can render yourself, translate yourself, and do radically different things in two different languages.
Arvind, we have half a minute for you to pronounce the final word.
Kiske baare mein you talking about? Arun, Kulatkar, to continue just for half a minute, there is one very well-known poem, Biograph, and in which the first line in Marathi is Laddu Bato. You distribute laddus. And this is what the midwife is saying. The midwife is saying, distribute sweets. When he translates it, it says, it's a boy, it's a boy, it's a boy. You see, this whole idea that you translate laddus because a boy has been born, he doesn't bring in the word laddus at all. So that is, now, Arun Kulhatkar could do it because he was translating his own poem. If I were to do it, they'd say, well, he doesn't know what he's saying. So,
Well, we have to leave it there, but I'm sure you will all agree that they do know what they're saying, these wonderful three poets, Ashok, Arvind and Ranjit Hoskote. Please give them a large round of applause. And I hope they will be signing their books afterwards in the author tent.
The author book signing tent is out of the venue, round to the left towards the Mughal tent. Please do find all of our panelists there to get your book signed. And join me in saying thank you again to our panelists, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Ashok Vajpeyi, Ranjit Hoskote, and Ruth Padel. Have you done it? Have you done it? I'll try and read out the thing. You give it a go. Do you want to just not do it? No. We have to do it?
Like, I don't know.
Okay. Do it. No, do it.
My God, it's so confusing. Please, can you do for me?
Please. I'm not doing the announcement then. All right. Quick.
Thank you.
We'll do that. Hold on.